So let's get into what I'm the topic for today's discussion. This is Bigness. Talking about Bigness. We're starting out with the Veil Guard, which is pretty funny. But Veil Guard, basically at this point, they've just admitted, I mean, this is like January 22nd, but so it's still fairly new. They admitted that it underperformed expectations. People were all like, oh, they got like 10,000 people. That's not bad. It's not a complete failure. But according to reports, Dragon Age Veilguard failed to meet EA's expectations by almost 50%, selling only 1.5 million units. So they were expecting it to at least sell 3 million. So, I mean, missing your mark by 50%, that is pretty bad. But at the same time, it's like, wow, I can't believe that I can't believe that you have to sell that much to make your money back. 3.5 million units. If they're being sold at like 70, that's over like $70 million. So if I assume the game itself probably cost, let's see, I mean, if you need to like maybe not quite 200 million, but probably, upwards of over $100 million to make the game, if that's how many units they want to move. And then lack of post launch DLC might have influenced its lower than expected sales. Might have influenced it. So I kind of think, like, especially when you look at this, Dragon Age Veilguard has been put on hold. A large portion of the writing staff behind Dragon Age Veilguard has been laid off and won't be working on Mass Effect 5. And I really hope the lessons we're learning here, Mass Effect 5 needs to stylistically look like Mass Effect and be subtle with its writing. Dragon Age died almost single-handedly from off the less realistic art style, not hitting with longtime fans, and clips of its bad writing going viral. If this happens again, BioWare won't be around for Mass Effect 5. Fingers crossed they nail it. So according to LinkedIn, restructuring of the termination of Dragon Age Veilguard's lead writer, Trick. What kind of first name is Trick? Trick Weeks's Karen West Weeks. What, they're like a husband and wife team? Why do they have the same last name? Narrative editor Ryan Corman, Jennifer Clavier, Cott, associate game producer Daniel Steele, Lena Anderson, product manager Michelle Flam, also let go, and writer Cheryl Chi, who wrote Dragon Age Lena, Isabel, Blackwell, and Harding as move to EA Motive. That's a lot of women. That's a lot of women in that in the list here. 1, 2, 3, like 4, 5. Assuming Trick is a man. I don't know. It's hard to say. You never know any. But this is kind of like the backdrop for like the idea that, obviously their focus on stuff like, top surgery scars, the sort of like I said, bad writing going viral with like the trans like lecture clip where it's like, oh, I misgendered you and now I got to do push-ups. That kind of stuff like turns a lot of like, their core demographic, men, like teenage to adult men. When they see that, they're like, maybe this isn't for me, I don't really want to deal with this. When you pay $70, if you're dropping that much money for a video game, you want it to wow you. You want it to like be like, whoa, this is super awesome. And it just seemed like it didn't hit. It did not hit that well with a lot of the longtime fans. So game has problems, and many people are here to point out the sort of wokeness of it. But I think the bigger problem than that is Bigness. Games ballooned into massive $200 million endeavors that carry the risk of bankrupting entire studios with their failures, i.e. Concord. What this leaves is studios trying to appeal to the lowest common denominator with safe, sanitized games. One of the big, criticisms of Veilguard, even from like normal people that aren't in like the culture war stuff, is that the dialogue felt safe and sanitized. they added a trans character, and then like they gave you no options to be mean to the trans character, which is kind of bizarre, in a role-playing game that at least supposedly lets you, especially, I remember the only BioWare game I played, you could like kill like half your party, if I remember right, if you go down the dark path, on the encoder. So the option, like not really like a lot of mean options, I think definitely hurt that game. So, if you want an open world like live service gacha game, you could get 5 of them. The marketing machine is what's really driving a lot of creative decisions, and games are the worst for it. So I wanted to sort of dive into some of the issues with the bloat that's in video games. So this is an older article, from October 2024, October 4th. But what I really want to kind of focus on, this is the CEO, Tim Wiltz, and he kind of talked about in this article about the sort of over-scoping that games tend to do. And one of the things he mentioned here, it's not necessarily that the genre has moved on, because great games will always do well. One of the things we try and do at Saber, and this is part of my job as a creative officer of all teams, is we have core belief that what you do every second, what happens when you push these buttons, that core gameplay loop is so critical. So we focus on the moment-to-moment interaction and gameplay and the feeling you have. And then we adhere to our core pillars, like be the ultimate Space Marine, melee, range, swarms, that's it. And a lot of the teams throughout development will overscope games. They look at some other games that just came out and say, oh, we got to do that. Let's add that. We got to do this. And they lose focus on the core, what actually makes the game fun. And I think he's 100% right with this, because you look at Space Marine 2, it was kind of praised as a return to the sort of like early 2000s era Xbox games, because it is a simple game. The stages aren't, open world. They're very straightforward. You kind of go down a set path. You have to fight through the swarms that attack you. It's usually like you get in a fight, there's a little bit of exploration with some exposition, then you get in another fight, maybe almost too much exploration, but they tightened it up a lot more with this game over Space Marine 1. That was a big criticism I had of it. But the sort of swarm technology and the fighting and really just the presentation, I think really carries the game, because like they said, the stuff that they're focused on, be the ultimate Space Marine, they nailed that really, really well. When you look at the motion that they have in it, the way you break through to the next level is like they either like pick it up and then throw this giant statue, or like they just kick, this rubble like out of the way. The way you stomp on things with like melee is amazing. The actual like kills, which I thought, man, am I just going to get sick of doing these like melee kills? But they're an important part of the is your sort of survival, is to do the melee to re-get your armor, the executions. And the range, you can like blow stuff away with blow people's heads off with bolters and whatnot. And the swarms are actually really, really cool. I think it's really what made the game so fun is the amount of like little chaff, and it actually creates a lot of kind of interesting strategy too. Like how do you use the chaff to like refill your armor? How do you avoid, because they can, if you let them go, they do a lot of damage to you. So you can't just focus on like the bigger creatures. You have to sort of deal with the swarms and sort of use the swarms to manage your armor to make sure you don't take a ton of damage. So they did a great job with this, and this kind of shows you, this is what it's done right, and it kind of and it also shows that people still want these games that the main campaign is like 8 to 10 hours. The multiplayer missions you complete in a few hours. So, this under 20 hours if you just went through the game once. And this is a $70 game. So you would think, that's crazy. That's crazy. You're presenting like $70 and you only have like 20 hours of content, let's say. If you just play through it once, you don't use any of the multiplayer or the versus mode, you could potentially increase your time exponentially. But that's all they had, especially at the beginning. And the idea of that still selling over 5 million copies, which is what they've gotten since then, it does seem kind of crazy. But if you do it well, if they focused on the stuff, they made a really good looking, like I said, the presentation and the gameplay merge perfectly to make you like feel like in that universe, and just the sort of like badass feeling you have when you're playing a Space Marine cutting stuff down. It's awesome. It is really awesome, but it is a risk for developers. And this is from a blog from a developer called Derek Yu. He's kind of famous for making Spelunky, and he's done some other indie stuff. I think he was the director on this UFO 50 or whatever it's called, or 51 or whatever it's called. It's like a collection of like mini games that he got together with a bunch of individual developers to make. I think it's done pretty well. But he's talking about broad appeal here. The other access of our framework is broad appeal, which, to be honest, can be a little bit unpleasant to think about. Like you're trying to win a popularity contest or something instead of being yourself. But to be clear, broadly appealing doesn't necessarily mean good or worthwhile. It just means that it appeals to a large number of people. Personally, I enjoy playing games that are popular and also games that are niche. But there's another way to think about popularity as a creator. I enjoy trying to find the intersection between my own interests and the larger gaming community, because that feels more of the back and forth communication I want from making art. I feel like I can learn and teach the most with that kind of mindset. Also, you could think about appealing as much or as little as you want. How much room do you have in your vision to consider your audience interest? As a new indie dev, you might want to focus on broadly appealing concepts until you understand your own voice better. Or maybe you already have a strong voice, but you want to save its full power for when you could shoulder more risks, i.e., you have more resources. Obviously, no one can predict with 100% certainty what will be popular. There are trends that we can see in the success of individual games, the evolutions of games as an art form. With these trends in mind, we can start developing a sense for what matters on a fundamental level to the average player. And maybe what is exciting about video games in a general sense. From there, you can decide how much you want to factor into your own plans. And number one here is bigness, this idea of having bigness. And you look at some of the success of these games like GTA, Breath of the Wild, Elden Ring. They're all like, these gigantic open world games. If you track how games have evolved, you can see there's a trend of virtual worlds getting larger, from a single screen to scrolling cameras to overall maps to large open worlds that could take hours to cross on foot. Games have tried to give player more agency over time, from totally linear level-based structures to free exploration. Putting it all together, we can see players are generally excited by the prospect of getting lost in large world games, where there's a lot of variety and a lot of ways for them to express their own creativity. I mean, we had Silver Bishop here talking about the Zomboid, Zomboid in there. That's another game, that has that sort of bigness in it. But when we look at, but he goes on to talk about it's not obviously every successful game has a large open world. So maybe it's accurate to say that players want games to feel big. They don't necessarily need to be big. That could mean the smaller game world that players could visit many times in many different ways. Randomized level generation, build run based gameplay as seen in games like Brogue, pictured right, are what indie developers have given games this big quality without resorting to large open worlds. Although it's less effective, another way to make a small game feel bigger is to add extra modes that put a different spin on static content. So you have games like, roguelikes have been very popular lately. And what they do is they give you like the idea of like infinite possibilities, randomly generated dungeons, random power-ups, no run feels the same. There's like an infinite, combination of possibilities that you could get from a run. Games like Vampire Survivors, which are insanely small games. It's just, a few levels, and the gameplay's fairly simple. But you have, you can get different power-ups, you can do different builds, you have different characters with different, abilities on it. So between that, you can have so many different possibilities that you can, play for hours and hours doing no more one run feels the same. Compelling characters and lore also generate a feeling that the game is larger than the sum of its part. So what players interact with in game might not be a lot, but you can give them the sense they're part of something larger. If they're excited enough by the possibilities, they might fill in the blanks themselves. You don't need that kind of world building right in a single game either. You can build on these ideas across a series. Oh boy. With each game you release, the shared world becomes larger, and each individual game starts to feel bigger by virtue of its connections. And I mean, I saw this with like Gravity Circuit. It's a game that's like Mega Man, has 8 robot masters, but what they added a hub world. They added, different upgrades to collect and special moves to unlock. They have 12 different collectibles in each stage. You have achievements. You have, different modes like Circuit Mode, New Game Plus. All of these, while I think that they distract from the core experience, there's no doubt that it makes, players feel like they're getting more bang for their buck. And you have games like Valheim, Core Keeper, Terraria, which have this sort of like, the maps are fairly big, but they also have this sort of sense that you start small and then you collect the, your upgrades, you get your right ores, you build your right armor, then you can expand to the next biome and new things to explore. And then you do that loop over and over and over again. So like you have this small world that slowly expands this giant world, and it takes a bunch of time, and it's, it's very satisfying. These games have been very popular. It's like a simple loop. It's a simple, core gameplay loop that gets you a lot of hours and a lot of exploration out of it, and makes the player feel like, they're paying $20, but they're getting, like easily like 40 to 50 hours worth of gameplay just by exploring each and every biome. It's very fun. It's fun and it's effective. I like these games. All those games I listed, I quite enjoyed. But it gives you that sort of feeling of bigness. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I do think that this sort of popularity kind of leaves not as much space for, like I say, like games like, Gravity Circuit that are, simple, really focused. I don't want a ton of filler. And I mean, you even think of like games like Valheim, the fact that the amount of time you have to spend traveling in some of these places, or like Core Keeper or Terraria, you do get stuff that eventually makes it quicker, but you do spend a lot of time simply just moving from A to B in these worlds. So like, is that, really fascinating gameplay? Not necessarily, but that's, part of the games. And some people, just want to get lost and spend some time in a game that doesn't really, challenge them constantly. They just want to chill. The sort of like chill genre of games. And, there's nothing wrong with that. The other way, games bloat, and then we look over here at the Smash Brothers here, is that there's a ton of sequels. There's a ton of long-running franchises, live service. Well, this leads them to start adding more and more as the games go on. Taking away features is kind of hard. You don't want to take away features. You want players to think that they're getting, more with each sequel. It's getting better and better. And an easy way to do that is just to keep adding more. Yeah, and this is where it started. Smash Bros. Ultimate, the series started with 12 playable characters. Now they have, how many do they have? 89 characters now. How are they going to beat it with the next game? Smash Bros. Super Ultimate. Where are they going to go from here? Is it going to have over 100 characters? Does this make the game better? It's, a lot of fun to sort of speculate what game, what new characters going to be added, but there's no there's no possibility that these characters are balanced at all. And look at stuff like Pokemon. You started with 150, now they have over 1,000. I've given up on trying to remember its names. I feel like, Pokemon has slowly kind of lost their impact as, it's like, oh, here's another set of 100 Pokemon. Here's another one. Here's one that's, a key. Here's one that's a blender. Who knows what household appliance they're going to put into the next Pokemon game. Here's a tea kettle. Actually, I think they probably do have a tea kettle already. But, you look at live service games. League of Legends, now has 170 champions. It had, back when I played it, back in 2011, it had 29 characters. Genshin Impact started with 22 characters when I started playing it. And now, 4 years later, it has 94 characters. And in these characters, the new characters and features add novelty, but they don't make the gameplay better. Often, like with games like League of Legends, even when I was still playing it, I noticed you have power creep, that makes old characters obsolete. Balance problems, usually, especially in the case like Riot, it usually cause them to sort of flatten the characters. Take away the stuff that's unique about the character because it's kind of hard to balance, and kind of bring every character to a baseline where you can sort of balance them out to make sure one's not more powerful than the other. And what it leads to is just boring gameplay. And what content, could keep older players engaged, one of the issues is that there's also a strong desire to attract new players. So it's not as the series go on, it gets harder and harder. They make it more complicated. It's usually the opposite. They make it easier and simpler. Look at Guilty Gear Strive, where they just seem to simplify the game more and more in order to appeal to a mass audience. So rather than the games taking more and more skill, you have your hardcore player base, which already knows how to play the game, instead of them trying to appeal to that audience by giving them a game that's even harder and take more skill so they can build it up. You have a game that just gets easier and easier. And of course, you just saw Elon Musk kind of becoming one of the best Diablo 4 players while not even leveling up his own character. So, how much skill does that game take? If a guy that can play, the game for maybe 100 hours can beat a guy that has played 1,000 hours. What sense does that make? And of course, sadly, the sort of video game media is, more than willing to play along to sort of push these games that are, these gigantic productions with, music scores, voice actors, facial recognition software. You look at the Game Awards, and again, they just focus on music, actors, graphics, art direction, esports programs. Almost nothing about gameplay unless we're talking about the game itself. That's the only way gameplay gets an award, is if it's in the sort of grand total of the game. And you have stuff like Wukong, Elden Ring, Final Fantasy got a ton of different nominations. Balatro got a nod. Astrobot managed to win because I think it was kind of a novelty, and I think PlayStation might be a little bit favored in those game awards. That's just me. But presentation has become more important than games or gameplay, and from a marketing perspective, it makes sense. But it's a shame because you'd think a media, the sort of trades media, would try and cultivate some sort of knowledge among the fans to sort of appreciate some of these simpler, really focused games, but they don't. They just want to be advertisers for big studios. And what these big studios have is, what the advantage they have over these smaller indies and stuff is that they can make these giant games with large presentations and celebrities in their games. So, that's what gets pushed. Without any sort of discipline and courage from developers or games media that wants to cultivate a sense of appreciation for elegant game design, there's a lot of headwind facing developers that just want to make solid games that respect the player's time and don't add a bunch of fluff to it. Even as you look at GDC, most of these talks are marketing. I mean, just look, they got a playlist. It's 74 things long of just, marketing, no budget DEI marketing for indie games, the golden rule of game promotion, inclusive marketing for indies. Wow. Very good. Making marketing mistakes. Again, it's just how Killer King built an esports scene on an indie budget. Wow. It's all about marketing your games. So, yep, that is one of the issues I think that's facing the industry. As long as it's about getting bigger and bigger with, larger worlds and presentations, the budgets are just going to continue to spiral out of control. So it's an issue. It's definitely an issue. But now it's time to move. But let's move on. Let me take a drink. We're going to cover the news.